Sarah had always loved spending her summer vacations at her grandmother's small cabin, nestled deep in the vast pine forest that surrounded the property. The house was located on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, a town that seemed to have stepped out of a storybook with its cobblestone streets, century-old homes, and a community that had known each other for generations. For Sarah, the cabin was a sanctuary where she could escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature and herself. When her grandmother passed away last winter, leaving her the cabin as an inheritance, Sarah felt a mix of grief and nostalgia. The childhood memories spent in that place came rushing back, and she decided it was time to return, to rediscover the peace she had always found among the towering pines. As she drove up the winding road leading to the cabin, Sarah was struck by how little the place had changed. The same dense forest flanked either side of the road. The same familiar scent of pine and earth filled the air. Yet, there was something different, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The trees seemed taller, their branches intertwining like a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sky. The sunlight that filtered through was faint, giving the forest an almost eerie, twilight feel even in the middle of the day. The cabin appeared as she remembered, small, rustic, with dark wooden beams and a stone chimney that curled smoke into the air during the colder months. She parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, carrying with it a subtle scent of moss and pine needles. As she walked toward the cabin, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet echoed in the stillness. Inside, the cabin was just as she had left it. The furniture was simple and worn from years of use, but it was familiar and comforting. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot as she walked through the rooms, running her fingers over the surfaces that had gathered dust in her absence. The walls were adorned with old family photos, and the fireplace still held the charred remains of the last fire her grandmother had lit. After unpacking her things and settling in, Sarah decided to take a walk through the woods, as she had done so many times before. She followed the familiar path that led from the back of the cabin, winding through the thick forest. The sound of her footsteps on the soft forest floor was the only noise that broke the silence. The deeper she ventured, the quieter it became, until even the rustling of leaves seemed to fade into the background. As she walked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was a sensation that crept up on her slowly, a prickling at the back of her neck that made her stop and look around. The trees stood silent, their tall, straight trunks like sentinels guarding the secrets of the forest. She tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, a leftover fear from childhood when the woods had seemed so vast and mysterious. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Eventually, she reached a small clearing that she remembered well. It was a place she had often come to as a child, where the sun broke through the canopy and bathed the ground in golden light. She sat down on a fallen log, closed her eyes, and let the sounds of the forest wash over her. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a lone owl. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But then, just as she was beginning to relax, she heard it. A soft whisper carried on the wind. Her eyes snapped open, and she looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, faint but distinct, like the rustle of fabric or the murmur of a distant conversation. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the whisper had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Shaking her head, she decided it was time to head back to the cabin. As she walked back along the path, the whisper echoed in her mind, a sound so subtle it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet it was undeniably human. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the events of the day played over and over in her mind. The whisper in the forest, the feeling of being watched. There was something unsettling about it all. She had always felt safe in these woods, but now there was a sense of unease, as if the forest itself was hiding something from her. The following days passed in a blur of routine. Sarah spent her time cleaning the cabin, organizing her grandmother's belongings, and exploring the surrounding area. She reacquainted herself with the town, visiting old haunts and catching up with neighbors who remembered her from childhood. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, The whispering and the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of her mind. Every night, as she lay in the dark, she would hear it again. The soft, indistinct murmur that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin. It was never loud enough to understand, but it was persistent, like a voice just out of reach. Sarah began to sleep with the windows closed, hoping to block out the sound, but it made no difference. The whispers found her no matter what she did. One evening, desperate for answers, Sarah decided to visit the old bookstore in town. It was a small, dusty place filled with books that had been gathering on the shelves for decades. The owner, Mr. Harris, was an elderly man with a keen interest in local history and folklore. If anyone knew anything about the strange occurrences in the forest, it would be him. As she entered the shop, the bell above the door jingled softly, and Mr. Harris looked up from behind the counter. He greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "Sarah, my dear, it's been too long," he said, coming around to give her a gentle hug. "What brings you here?" "I'm looking for some information, Mr. Harris," she said, hesitating slightly. "About the forest. Have you ever heard of anything strange happening there?" Mr. Harris's smile faded slightly, and he studied her with a thoughtful expression. "Strange, you say? The woods have always had their share of mysteries. There are stories, old ones, about the forest being haunted by spirits or something of the sort. But those are just tales, nothing to be taken too seriously." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't help feeling that there was more to the story. "What kind of spirits?" Mr. Harris sighed, leaning against the counter. "Well, some say the forest is alive, that it has a soul. They believe that the trees can hear us, that they remember things that have happened there over the centuries. There are legends about people who disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again, and others who returned but were changed, as if the forest had taken something from them." "Do you think that's what the whispers are?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harris's eyes widened slightly. "You've heard them?" She nodded, feeling a chill run down her spine. "Every night. It's like someone is trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what they're saying." The old man looked troubled, and he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The whispers. Yes, I've heard of them. Some say they're the voices of those who were lost in the woods. Others say it's the forest itself, trying to communicate. Whatever it is, you're not the first to hear them." "Is there anything I can do?" Sarah asked, feeling a growing sense of dread. Mr. Harris reached under the counter and pulled out a small, worn book. He handed it to her with a solemn expression. "This might help you. It's a collection of old stories and folklore from this area. It won't have all the answers, but it might give you some insight into what you're dealing with." Sarah thanked him and took the book home. That night, she sat by the fireplace, flipping through the pages filled with tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. The stories were chilling, speaking of spirits, curses, and ancient rituals performed in the heart of the forest. But one story in particular caught her attention. It was about a tree, an old pine tree said to be the guardian of the forest, a tree that held the memories of the land. As she read, Sarah began to piece together a theory. The tree she had found in the clearing, the one with the strange symbol carved into it, was the key. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, it all started after she touched that tree. Perhaps it was trying to tell her something that had been buried in the forest for centuries. The next day, she returned to the clearing. The air was thick with anticipation as she approached the ancient pine tree. The symbol on the trunk was more prominent now, as if it had grown deeper since her last visit. Sarah reached out and placed her hand on the tree, closing her eyes and focusing on the whispers that had haunted her for weeks. This time, the whispers were clearer. They swirled around her, echoing in her mind, words forming in a language she couldn't understand. But there was a sense of urgency, of pleading. The forest was alive, and it was calling to her. Sarah spent the rest of the day in the clearing, trying to decipher the whispers. She felt a connection with the tree, a bond that she couldn't explain. It was as if the forest was trying to show her something, to guide her. And then, as the sun began to set, she felt a strange sensation. A vision, perhaps, or a memory not her own. She saw a figure, a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing in the same clearing, her hand resting on the tree. The woman was speaking softly, her voice blending with the whispers. And then, in a flash, Sarah saw the woman turn and walk away, disappearing into the forest, her figure fading like a shadow. When Sarah opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do. The woman in the vision was her grandmother, and the whispers were a warning. Something was coming, something dark and ancient that the forest had been guarding against for centuries. In the days that followed, Sarah prepared. She read through the old book, learning as much as she could about the rituals and symbols used to protect the land. She gathered herbs, stones, and other materials mentioned in the texts, and she returned to the clearing every day, strengthening her connection with the tree. On the night of the next full moon, Sarah was ready. She stood in the clearing, the air thick with anticipation, as the moon rose high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, guiding her every move. She placed the herbs and stones in a circle around the tree, chanting the words she had learned from the book. The air crackled with energy, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Sarah felt a surge of power flow through her, connecting her to the land, to the trees, to the very soul of the forest. And then the ground began to tremble. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the woods, as if something was awakening from a long slumber. The whispers grew frantic, swirling around her in a cacophony of voices. Sarah didn't falter. She continued the ritual, her voice steady, her resolve unshaken. The ground shook harder, and she could feel the ancient force rising, something dark and malevolent that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. But the forest was with her. The trees stood tall, their branches reaching out as if to shield her, and the whispers united, forming a single, clear voice that echoed in her mind. Protect what is hidden. With a final chant, Sarah completed the ritual. The earth trembled one last time, and then there was silence. The air was still, the forest calm. The dark force had been contained, sealed away once more by the ancient power of the land. Sarah collapsed to the ground, exhausted but triumphant. The forest had chosen her, and she had answered the call. The whispers faded, leaving only a sense of peace, a deep connection to the land that would remain with her forever. As she made her way back to the cabin, Sarah knew her life had changed. She was no longer just a visitor to Pine Ridge. She was a guardian, a protector of the ancient secrets hidden in the forest. And as she looked up at the moonlit trees, she felt a sense of belonging, of home. The forest had its guardian, and Sarah was ready to embrace her new role, to face whatever the future held. The whispers in the pines had brought her back to where she belonged, and she was at peace with the knowledge that she was part of something much greater than herself. The town of Hollow Creek had always seemed like the perfect place to disappear. Nestled deep within the rolling hills and dense forests of New England, it was the kind of town that time forgot. The cobblestone streets, the ancient oaks lining the sidewalks, and the Victorian houses with their weathered facades all gave the place an air of quiet, old-world charm. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A tension that buzzed just below the threshold of awareness, like a whisper you could never quite catch. Emma Hawthorne felt it the moment she arrived. She had come to Hollow Creek seeking refuge, a place to start over after the tumultuous end of her marriage. The town, with its quaint shops and friendly faces, seemed like a balm for her wounded spirit. She purchased an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts, a sprawling estate that had been on the market for years, neglected and forgotten, much like Emma herself. The house stood at the edge of town, where the forest crept up close, its dense canopy casting long shadows over the lawn. From the moment Emma stepped inside, she felt a strange sense of unease. The floors creaked underfoot, the air was thick with the scent of age and dust, and the walls seemed to close in around her. But there was also a pull, a strange attraction she couldn't explain, a feeling that this place had been waiting for her. The locals welcomed her politely, but there was a wariness in their eyes when they learned where she was staying. They told her stories, old legends passed down through generations about the town's darker past. The most persistent of these was the tale of the Shadow of Midnight. It was said that on nights of the full moon, a shadowy figure would appear in the town, bringing with it an unnatural cold and a suffocating silence. Those who encountered it were found the next day, alive but altered, some with no memory of who they were, others unable to speak of what they had seen. Emma laughed off these stories as superstitious nonsense, the kind of small-town folklore meant to scare children and newcomers. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. The house, with its labyrinth of rooms and dark corners, seemed to hum with a life of its own, the walls whispering secrets she couldn't quite decipher. As the full moon approached, the tension in the town grew palpable. The once bustling streets emptied earlier each day, and the friendly smiles of her neighbors became tight-lipped, their gazes darting nervously to the horizon as dusk approached. Emma noticed how the conversations shifted whenever she mentioned the coming full moon, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. On the night of the full moon, Emma found herself unable to sleep. The house was unnaturally quiet, the usual creaks and groans of the old wood silenced. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quiet. Finally, she gave up on sleep and decided to get some fresh air. She stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the chill. The night was clear, the full moon hanging low in the sky, casting a cold, silver light over the landscape. The town was bathed in an eerie glow, the shadows long and deep, like ink spilled across the cobblestone streets. As she stood there, breathing in the crisp air, she heard it, the faintest of whispers, just at the edge of her hearing. It was a sound so subtle that she might have dismissed it as the wind, had it not been for the way it seemed to call her name. Emma turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing, just the silent silhouettes of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The whisper came again, more insistent this time, drawing her gaze to the far end of the street. There, where the light of the moon barely reached, she saw it. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moving slowly toward her. It wasn't a person. It had no defined form, just a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Emma's heart began to pound in her chest, a cold sweat breaking out along her spine. She wanted to move, to run back inside and lock the door, but her feet felt glued to the spot. The shadow continued to approach, bringing with it a wave of cold so intense it felt as if the warmth was being sucked from her very bones. As the shadow drew closer, the air around her grew thick, pressing in on her like a physical force. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but she still couldn't make out the words. It was as if the shadow itself was trying to speak to her, to tell her something she desperately needed to know. Then, as the shadow reached the base of her porch, it stopped. The air was so cold now that she could see her breath, misting in the pale moonlight. The whispering ceased, leaving a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow all sound. Emma's eyes were locked on the shadow, which now hovered just a few feet away, its shape shifting and twisting like smoke caught in an invisible wind. Without warning, the shadow surged forward, and Emma felt a sharp, icy pain stab through her chest. She gasped, clutching at her heart, but there was nothing there, just the cold, searing its way through her veins. The world around her began to blur, the edges of her vision darkening as the shadow enveloped her. Just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, a sound broke through the silence, the tolling of the town's church bell, its deep, resonant tones cutting through the night. With each chime, the shadow seemed to recoil, its form flickering and shrinking back. Emma felt the pressure on her chest ease, the cold retreating as the bell continued to ring. The shadow retreated down the street, moving faster now, as if fleeing from the sound. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the faintest echo of its whisper. Emma collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath, her body trembling from the cold and the terror that had gripped her. When she finally regained control of her limbs, she stumbled inside and bolted the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the lock. She collapsed onto the floor, her back against the door, and waited, listening for any sign that the shadow might return. But the house was silent, the only sound the ragged gasp of her own breath. For the rest of the night, Emma sat huddled in the corner of her bedroom, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, too afraid to sleep. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had seen. The shadow had been real, of that she was certain. But what was it? And why had it come for her? The next morning, she found herself avoiding the curious stares of her neighbors as she walked through town. They knew. She could see it in their eyes. They knew about the shadow and what it had done to her. But no one said anything, just offered tight smiles and hurried greetings before turning away. Emma returned to her house, feeling more alone than ever. She knew she couldn't stay in Hollow Creek, not after what had happened. But something held her back, a feeling that leaving now would only make things worse. She needed answers, and she knew that the only place to find them was in the town's history. She spent the next few days combing through old records at the library, searching for any mention of the shadow. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a stern demeanor, was surprisingly helpful, pointing Emma toward a collection of journals and letters from the town's founders. It was in one of these journals that Emma finally found what she was looking for, a detailed account of the shadow's first appearance. The journal belonged to Samuel Blackwood, one of the town's original settlers. His words were written in a tight, spidery script, the ink faded with age but still legible. Samuel wrote of the town's early days, of the struggle to survive in the harsh New England winters, and of the strange occurrences in the forest that bordered the town. He described how the settlers had come across an ancient burial ground deep in the woods, a place that the indigenous tribes had warned them to avoid. But the settlers, desperate for land, had ignored the warnings and built their homes on the sacred ground. It was shortly after this that the shadow first appeared. Samuel described it as a dark presence, a manifestation of the land's anger at being desecrated. It would come on nights of the full moon, moving through the town like a living darkness, leaving a trail of ice and silence in its wake. According to Samuel, the shadow was not just a spirit, but a guardian of the land, bound by an ancient curse to protect the sacred ground. The settlers had tried to appease it with offerings and rituals, but nothing seemed to work. Over time, the town grew accustomed to the shadow, learning to live with its presence, but always in fear of what it might do. Emma read the journal with growing dread, realizing that the shadow's appearance was not a random event. It was tied to the land, to the very soil on which the town was built, and it had chosen her, for reasons she did not yet understand. She returned to her house, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on her. The full moon would come again in a month, and she needed to be ready. She spent the following weeks preparing, gathering the materials mentioned in Samuel's journal, herbs, stones, and other objects said to hold protective power. On the night of the next full moon, Emma was ready. She stood on her porch, the air thick with anticipation, as the moon rose high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the town. The silence was overwhelming, as if the world was holding its breath. Then the shadow appeared. It moved down the street like a living darkness, its form shifting and changing, as if it were made of smoke. As it approached, the temperature dropped, and Emma could see her breath misting in the air. She stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, as the shadow came closer. When it was only a few feet away, Emma began the ritual. She chanted the words she had learned, holding the protective objects in her hands, and felt a surge of energy course through her. The shadow paused, as if it were listening, and then it began to change. The darkness started to recede, revealing a figure within. A tall, spectral figure with eyes that glowed like embers. The figure spoke, its voice a low, rumbling echo that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You have awakened the old ways," it said. "The balance must be restored." Emma stood her ground, her voice steady as she responded. "I seek to understand, not to harm. What must I do?" The figure regarded her for a long moment, and then it began to speak, telling her of the land's history, of the pact that had been made between the settlers and the indigenous tribes, and of the rituals that had been forgotten. It spoke of the need to honor the land, to remember the old ways, and to protect the balance between the natural and the human world. As the figure spoke, Emma felt a deep connection to the land, a sense of belonging that she had never felt before. She understood now that she had been chosen to be a guardian, to restore the balance and protect the land from those who would harm it. When the figure finished speaking, it began to fade, the shadow retreating into the darkness. But before it disappeared completely, it left Emma with a final warning. "The land remembers," it said, "and it will not be forgotten." As the shadow vanished, the silence lifted, and the night returned to normal. Emma stood there for a long time, processing what had just happened. She knew that her life had changed, that she had been given a responsibility that she could not ignore. In the days that followed, Emma began to take action. She reached out to the town, sharing what she had learned and urging them to remember the old ways. She organized rituals and ceremonies, honoring the land and its history, and she worked to protect the town from further harm. The shadow did not return, but Emma knew that it was still there, watching, waiting, and she was ready. She had become the guardian of Hollow Creek, and she would do whatever it took to protect the land and its people. As the months passed, the town began to change. The people became more connected to the land, more aware of their impact on the environment. They planted trees, restored sacred sites, and honored the old traditions. And in return, the land began to heal. Emma knew that her journey was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her place in the world, and she was at peace with the knowledge that she was part of something much greater than herself. The shadow of midnight had brought her to where she belonged, and she was ready to face whatever the future held. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the dense forest that surrounded the small town of Ravenswood. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hoot of an owl, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. In the heart of this secluded town, a tale of forgotten memories and haunting echoes was about to unfold. Maggie Reynolds had always been curious about her family's past. Her grandmother, Eleanor, often spoke of a time when the Reynolds family was revered in Ravenswood, but there were gaps in the stories, mysterious events that were never fully explained. After Eleanor's passing, Maggie inherited an old, dusty journal that had been hidden away in the attic for decades. Its weathered pages held secrets that would change Maggie's life forever. As Maggie sat in her grandmother's rocking chair, the journal open on her lap, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The first entry was dated July 15th, 1952. It spoke of a young girl named Eliza who had gone missing in the woods. The townsfolk had searched for weeks, but she was never found. The only clue was a locket with a picture of Eliza and her parents, discovered near an old, abandoned cabin deep in the forest. Determined to uncover the truth, Maggie decided to visit the cabin. She packed a small bag with essentials and set off early the next morning. The path to the cabin was overgrown, and the forest seemed to close in around her as she walked. The further she ventured, the more she felt as though she was being watched. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, and the rustling leaves sounded like whispers of forgotten voices. When Maggie finally reached the cabin, it looked just as it had been described in the journal, dilapidated and covered in ivy. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. The air was stale, and the silence was deafening. As she explored the cabin, Maggie found an old, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. Its surface was cracked, and the frame was tarnished with age. She stared into the mirror, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Shaking off the unease, she continued her search. In the corner of the cabin, she discovered a small trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug. With great effort, she pried it open and descended the rickety ladder into a dark cellar. The air was musty, and the walls were lined with shelves of old books and trinkets. At the far end of the cellar, she found a large, leather-bound book. Its cover was embossed with the Reynolds family crest. Maggie opened the book and began to read. It was a detailed account of the family's history, written by her great-grandfather, William Reynolds. The entries grew darker and more frantic as she progressed. William wrote of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and sightings of a ghostly figure resembling Eliza. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1952. It spoke of a ritual that William had performed in an attempt to communicate with Eliza's spirit. He described a mirror, much like the one hanging in the cabin, that served as a portal to the spirit world. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, and William had inadvertently trapped Eliza's spirit in the mirror, along with other restless souls. Maggie's heart raced as she realized the significance of the mirror upstairs. She rushed back up the ladder and stood before the cracked glass. She could feel a presence emanating from it, a cold, malevolent force that sent chills down her spine. Summoning all her courage, she placed her hand on the mirror's surface and whispered Eliza's name. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and a figure began to materialize. It was Eliza, her eyes wide with fear and sorrow. She reached out to Maggie, her voice a faint whisper. "Help us," she pleaded. "Release us from this torment." Maggie knew she had to perform the ritual to free the trapped spirits, but she also understood the danger. She carefully followed the instructions detailed in her great-grandfather's journal. As she chanted the incantation, the cabin began to tremble, and the air grew cold. The mirror's surface glowed with an eerie light, and the trapped souls began to emerge. One by one, the spirits floated out of the mirror, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. Eliza was the last to emerge. She smiled at Maggie, her form gradually fading into the light. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing completely. The cabin fell silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Maggie felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had done it. She had freed the forgotten souls and uncovered the truth about her family's dark past. As she left the cabin and made her way back to Ravenswood, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was far from over. In the days that followed, Maggie continued to research her family's history. She discovered that the mirror had originally belonged to a powerful sorcerer who had used it to trap the souls of his enemies. The mirror had been passed down through generations, causing untold suffering to those who possessed it. Determined to prevent further harm, Maggie decided to destroy the mirror. She returned to the cabin with a sledgehammer and shattered the cursed glass into 1,000 pieces. As the shards scattered across the floor, she felt a sense of finality. The echoes of the forgotten had been silenced, and the souls were finally at rest. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. Among the shattered glass, a single, unbroken shard lay gleaming on the floor. Maggie picked it up, and a chill ran down her spine. In its reflection, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Maggie realized that the echoes of the forgotten were not so easily silenced. The mirror's curse had not been fully broken, and the spirits would continue to haunt those who dared to uncover the truth. She knew that her journey was far from over and that she would need to find a way to truly end the curse once and for all. As she left the cabin, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She would not rest until the echoes of the forgotten were silenced forever. The forest seemed less ominous as she made her way back to Ravenswood, the path ahead illuminated by the light of the rising sun. Maggie knew that she had a long road ahead, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay in wait. The following weeks were a blur of research and restless nights for Maggie. She delved deeper into the history of Ravenswood, uncovering stories of other families who had encountered the cursed mirror. Each story was more horrifying than the last, filled with madness and death. It became clear that the mirror's power extended beyond her family, ensnaring anyone who came into contact with it. One evening, as she pored over old town records in the dim light of her study, Maggie came across a name that sent a chill down her spine: Henry Blackwood. He was a notorious occultist who had lived in Ravenswood in the early 1900s. According to the records, Blackwood had been fascinated by dark magic and had conducted numerous rituals in the hopes of gaining eternal life. Maggie felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized that the sorcerer who had created the mirror was none other than Henry Blackwood. The more she read, the more she understood the depth of Blackwood's depravity. He had used the mirror to trap the souls of those he deemed unworthy, feeding off their despair to sustain his own life. The journal mentioned a secret chamber beneath his mansion, where he performed his most vile rituals. Maggie knew she had to find this chamber and destroy whatever remnants of Blackwood's dark magic still lingered. The next morning, Maggie set out for the old Blackwood mansion. It had long been abandoned, its decaying walls hidden beneath a thick canopy of ivy. As she approached the mansion, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the wails of tormented souls. She pushed open the creaking gate and made her way inside. The interior of the mansion was a labyrinth of dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. Every step Maggie took echoed through the empty halls, heightening her sense of unease. She followed the descriptions from the journal, navigating through the dark corridors until she found a hidden door behind a tattered tapestry. It led to a narrow staircase descending into the bowels of the mansion. Maggie's heart pounded as she descended the steps, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, she found a heavy wooden door, its surface etched with arcane symbols. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was lit by the faint glow of candlelight, casting flickering shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in ancient texts and strange artifacts. Maggie's eyes were drawn to a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was identical to the one she had destroyed in the cabin, its surface shimmering with a malevolent light. She approached the mirror cautiously, feeling its dark energy pulsate through the air. As she stood before the mirror, she heard a voice whispering her name. It was a deep, guttural voice that sent chills down her spine. "Maggie Reynolds," it hissed. "You cannot escape the fate that binds us." Maggie steeled herself, clutching the sledgehammer she had brought with her. "I'm here to end this," she declared, raising the hammer above her head. But before she could strike, a figure materialized in the mirror. It was Henry Blackwood, his eyes burning with malice. "You think you can destroy me?" Blackwood sneered. "I am eternal. My power will never fade." Maggie felt a surge of anger and fear. She swung the hammer with all her might, shattering the mirror into countless pieces. The room was filled with a blinding light, and she was thrown to the ground by the force of the explosion. When the light faded, the chamber was silent once more. Gasping for breath, Maggie rose to her feet. The mirror was gone, its shards scattered across the floor. But something felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over her lifted. She knew that Blackwood's spirit had been banished, and the souls he had trapped were finally free. Exhausted but triumphant, Maggie made her way back up the stairs and out of the mansion. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. She breathed in the fresh air, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. Back in Ravenswood, Maggie was hailed as a hero. The townsfolk, who had long lived in fear of the dark forces that plagued their town, were grateful for her bravery. She received letters of thanks from people whose ancestors had been freed from Blackwood's curse, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing she had made a difference. Despite the victory, Maggie knew her journey wasn't truly over. The knowledge she had gained about dark magic and the occult couldn't be forgotten. She decided to dedicate her life to studying and combating supernatural threats, ensuring that no one else would suffer as her family had. Years passed, and Maggie became a renowned expert in the paranormal. She traveled the world, investigating haunted locations and helping those tormented by restless spirits. She never forgot the lessons she had learned in Ravenswood, and she carried the memory of Eliza and the other trapped souls with her always. One autumn evening, as Maggie sat in her study surrounded by books and artifacts, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine. She turned to see a faint, glowing figure standing in the corner of the room. It was Eliza, her face serene and free of fear. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, her voice like a gentle breeze. "We are at peace now because of you." Maggie smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm glad," she replied softly. "Rest well, Eliza." As the spirit faded into the night, Maggie felt a sense of closure. The echoes of the forgotten had finally been silenced, and the curse that had plagued her family was no more. She knew that her work would continue, but for the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. Several years later, a new family moved into the old Blackwood mansion. The Thompsons were unaware of the mansion's dark history, drawn by its grandeur and secluded charm. They set about restoring the decaying building, breathing new life into its ancient walls. One afternoon, as young Emily Thompson explored the mansion's attic, she stumbled upon a dusty, leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. Curious, she opened it and began to read. The pages were filled with tales of dark rituals, cursed mirrors, and a brave woman named Maggie Reynolds who had fought to free trapped souls. Emily's eyes widened with fascination as she read about Maggie's adventures. She felt a strange connection to the story, as though the echoes of the past were calling out to her. Determined to learn more, she shared the journal with her parents, who were equally intrigued. The Thompsons soon became engrossed in uncovering the mansion's history. They discovered hidden rooms and secret passages, each revealing more about the dark legacy of Henry Blackwood. They learned about the cursed mirror and the ritual chamber where Maggie had vanquished Blackwood's spirit. Despite the unsettling discoveries, the Thompsons felt a deep respect for Maggie and her bravery. They decided to honor her memory by preserving the mansion as a historical site, sharing its story with the world. They opened their doors to researchers and paranormal enthusiasts, allowing others to learn from the past and pay their respects to the forgotten souls. As the years went by, the Blackwood Mansion became a beacon of hope and knowledge. It stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of courage in the face of darkness. Visitors from all over the world came to hear the story of Maggie Reynolds and the echoes of the forgotten, leaving with a sense of awe and inspiration. Maggie's legacy lived on, not just in the annals of history, but in the hearts of those who heard her story. The mansion, once a place of fear and despair, had been transformed into a symbol of redemption and healing. And as the sun set over Ravenswood, casting long shadows over the ancient trees, the echoes of the forgotten were finally laid to rest. In the quiet moments of dusk, when the wind whispered through the leaves and the owls hooted in the distance, one could almost hear the faint, comforting voice of Maggie Reynolds, assuring that the past was no longer a burden, but a lesson to guide the future.